This document is a pro se legal filing, submitted directly to the docket of the United States Supreme Court. Under 28 U.S.C. Section 2241, a writ of habeas corpus is a mechanism almost entirely reserved for prisoners challenging actual criminal incarceration. But the petitioner who drafted this text is not sitting in a federal penitentiary. He is operating from his own corporate office under what he classifies as a constructive de facto office arrest. This arrest is actively enforced by an unexecuted civil warrant, known as a capias, issued by a local state-level family court. By escalating a local civil dispute to the Supreme Court, the petitioner is attempting to test whether federal jurisdiction can reach into the administrative machinery of a state court. The eccentric details of the narrative are secondary to the way the filing maps the specific structural mechanics of modern civil procedure. The Questions Presented section of the petition points directly to two legal concepts: quasi-criminal contempt and e-service. This painting, featured on the petitioner's own book cover, depicts a chess match between a young man and the devil. Within the context of the petition, the two players represent a structural conflict, the drive for rapid state procedure efficiency competing against the rigid requirements of federal due process. The document details two specific procedural mechanisms: the e-service paradox and the tertiary recusal trap. The text includes extensive claims regarding proprietary defense technologies and federal whistleblowing. We are going to bypass those elements entirely and analyze strictly the structural architecture of the legal maneuvers described. This analysis will reverse engineer those mechanics to see if a standard defensive legal move can actually be made within this specific framework. Before a court can initiate quasi-criminal contempt proceedings against a citizen, the law requires strict personal jurisdiction. The individual must be physically served with documentation. This animated diagram illustrates a collision of legal standards. On the left is Texas Rule of Civil Procedure 21F, which authorizes electronic service for standard court pleadings. On the right is the 14th Amendment Due Process Clause, which demands physical notice before a loss of liberty. To accelerate case movement, a local court might attempt to transition a physical court order into a purely digital workflow, utilizing an email delivery receipt in place of a process server. But a digital email receipt cannot legally satisfy the constitutional burden of actual personal service when physical liberty is at stake. The petition submits evidence of what it calls chronological docket fraud to circumvent this firewall. The filing alleges the court clerk's office manually manipulated the digital public record to mask the fact that personal service never occurred. This timeline tracks the specific discrepancy. A digital docket entry was logged into the court system on a Wednesday, April 15th. However, the text of that April 15th entry claimed that personal physical service was executed on April 17th, 2 days in the future. The trial court allegedly relied on this mathematically impossible digital entry to justify issuing a physical capias warrant for the petitioner's arrest. Substituting an unverified digital database entry for physical human service severs the required constitutional chain of custody. Without it, any resulting arrest warrant is legally void. The next mechanism involves judicial recusal. The bedrock rule in Texas is Rule of Civil Procedure 18A G1. This logic flowchart shows the standard procedure.
Filing a valid motion to recuse under this rule triggers an absolute, mandatory, and automatic stay of all trial court proceedings. But a conflicting counterstatute exists: Texas Civil Practice and Remedies Code, Section 30.016, which governs tertiary or third motions to recuse. Opposing counsel allegedly utilized this secondary statute to bypass the mandatory stay and keep the physical arrest warrant active, despite the new recusal filing. The petitioner's defense against this relies on a technical parsing of the statutory text. The wording of Section 30.016 states that the bypass only applies to a third motion filed against a judge of the exact same court. Because the motion in question was administratively referred upward to a regional presiding judge, it legally reset. It became a first-pass motion directed at an entirely different judicial officer. This reset means the mandatory freeze legally overrides the bypass statute. With the stay intact, all active enforcement of the capias warrant is rendered void. Yet, the trial judge allegedly continued to enforce physical warrants while the recusal motion sat unanswered in an administrative queue for 169 days.
The system actively executes unappealable warrants while simultaneously using an administrative limbo to block any right to an interlocutory appeal. The citizen is left without a legal mechanism to halt the arrest. This state-level procedural gridlock is simultaneously applied against the petitioner's corporate entities. Standard legal procedure dictates that a corporate entity cannot appear pro se. It must be represented by a licensed attorney. When the self-represented corporate owner attempted to file jurisdictional objections, pointing out a lack of service, the court allegedly used this rule to refuse to hear the filings entirely. The owner faces a dilemma: incur legal fees to defend an entity that was never legally served, or accept an illegal default judgment against their assets. This corporate constraint connects directly back to the e-service paradox. The lack of proper physical service initiates the conflict, and the representation rule blocks the defense. Digital service evasion, recusal traps, and corporate representation constraints work together. They build a closed architectural system that is largely immune to traditional legal defense. This closed system forms the basis of the petitioner's federal habeas corpus claim against the state apparatus. Returning to the chessboard model, we see how these procedural rules operate. They box a litigant into a corner where no legal moves remain, even when the opponent has failed to establish a legitimate check. The structural contradiction lies in the system's internal logic, the application of two valid statutes that, when combined, cancel out the possibility of a legal remedy. When a court utilizes digital tools to bypass physical service requirements and administrative loopholes to bypass mandatory stays, it creates a closed system entirely insulated from state-level appellate review. This document, signed under the unsworn declaration of Title 28, represents an individual seeking a federal override to that closed system. As court dockets increasingly rely on automated digital systems and e-filing architectures, these procedural edge case vulnerabilities will mature into mainstream threats. The factual validity of this specific whistleblower case is secondary. The logical and legal validity of the structural trap it exposes is the actual issue. Ultimately, the conflict is between digital procedural efficiency and the physical requirements of constitutional due process.